Just a tad bit over 20 years ago, Resident Evil was released for the Sony PlayStation in March of 1996. Developed and published by the video game studio Capcom, it would end up being just as popular as Capcom's Star series, Street Fighter. So let's just start off with the same thing that every video game starts off with: development. That guy up there is Shinji Mikami, the creator of the Resident Evil series. Prior to his involvement with the series, he had been the director of a string of several Disney licensed games. But it was time for Mikami to venture into more mature material. Resident Evil was originally conceptualized to be a sequel to another survival horror game, Sweet Home, for the Famicom. Sweet Home was created by developer Takeru Fujiwara, who previously produced Mega Man X. Fujiwara brought this idea to Capcom, who told Fujiwara to find a director. He looked towards Mikami, who has said that he views Fujiwara as a scary master. With this, Mikami began his involvement in the Resident Evil series. In 1993, Mikami began the development of Resident Evil. On his own for the first 6 months, he created concept sketches, character designs, and wrote over 40 pages of script. During these early stages, Resident Evil was planned to be a very different game. It was intended to be an FPS action game, drawing much more heavily from the Sweet Home's plot. A supernatural storyline in the vein of Sweet Home was planned, but around the time that Mikami decided that the FPS route wasn't going to pan out due to technological constraints, he steered the development in a new direction. Inspired by George Romero's Dead series, and negatively enforced by his disappointment in Lucio Fulci's 1979 film Zombie 2, he switched to the undead. Not to say he dropped the Sweet Home angle by any means. Even after switching to zombies, Resident Evil still featured an obscene amount of inspiration from Sweet Home. Even the loading screen doors, which Resident Evil is so famous for, were adapted straight from Sweet Home. For real, just look at this nonsense. Along with the switch to zombies, it was around this time in development that the game Alone in the Dark was made known to Mikami. Alone in the Dark featured a camera system where camera angles were fixed, allowing a greater sense of cinematography. Mikami mulled around the idea of using the same system in Resident Evil, and even though he believed it dampened immersion, he eventually decided it was a good call, for several reasons. Most importantly, it allowed the use of pre-rendered backgrounds, contrasting his original plan to make the game fully 3D. Pre-rendered backgrounds allowed a level of graphical fidelity magnitudes higher than full 3D backgrounds. This allowed the game to stand out graphically, regardless of the dated polygonal character models. Also, the PlayStation had notorious problems with polygon warping, and pre-rendered backgrounds helped alleviate this problem. Also, the camera style allows for a much higher sense of danger in certain situations. Cameras were placed strategically, often hiding what lurked beyond the scope of each scene. It's not an uncommon occurrence for the camera to switch to a new scene with several enemies that were unknown of moments before. By the end of Resident Evil's development, Mikami's small team had grown to nearly 80 people, outclassing many other teams at Capcom at the time. This team would later be known as Capcom Production Team 4. Resident Evil would end up being the game that defined the survival horror genre, setting a few important guidelines which games would adhere to, even today. Number 1 is difficulty. Complaining about a game's difficulty is a trademark of survival horror. Whether it be because an enemy is too powerful or frustrating, or that a complicated puzzle has a player stumped, difficulty still shows its face in all survival horror games. If the game isn't difficult in some way, the horror part rarely works. Difficulty causes tension, which causes the player to react better to scenes that are meant to be scary. If the enemies are easy to defeat, why would they be scared? Number 2 is helplessness. It's key to make the player feel helpless, which goes hand in hand with difficulty. Keeping the player on a tight leash is necessary. Give them too much ammunition or healing items, and they'll begin treating the game as an action game, blasting their way through rooms with wild abandon. The player is supposed to barely make it through rooms. Making it to the next room is supposed to be an accomplishment, not just an idle objective. Survival horror is about surviving, not being a badass. Number 3 is combat, or rather, the lack of it. Survival horror isn't supposed to be a shooting gallery, it's supposed to be a slow grind to the end. Survival horror games will often give the player ways to escape a room in a pacifistic manner, avoiding enemies and expending as little of their supplies as possible. Learning the behavior of enemies in order to weave around them safely, or taking advantage of the stealth system if there is one, is a crucial aspect of the genre. John Rambo has no place here. Oh yeah, one more very important thing. It's just gotta be. This is where most survival horror games stumble from my experience. Pacing is incontrovertibly important for eliciting big scares from the player, and Resident Evil does this exceedingly well. As a matter of fact, Resident Evil does all of these things well, being the game that set these protocols. It's oppressively difficult, partly due to its archaic tank controls. The puzzles, while simple enough, still take a bit of brain power, and failing the puzzle often leads to the player's death. Due to the strict rationing of ammunition and healing items, the helplessness in combat are quickly taken care of, and the scary, it's in no short supply. So, how did Resident Evil fare? Let's talk about the context before its release, and then we can get some real numbers in. I love me some numbers. In the late summer of 1995, the Sony PlayStation was released in the United States. By the spring of next year, only two sizably popular games have been released in the States, Rayman and Twisted Metal. The US was ready for a real, true blockbuster, and in the spring of 1996, Resident Evil exploded onto the scene. It immediately flew to the top of bestseller lists, and was outrageously well reviewed. Every critical review of the game was glowing, with Famitsu scoring it at a 38 out of 40, tied for the second best of 1996. The only game that scored higher?
It's me, Mario!
Metacritic, a popular review aggregator, has it scored at a 91 out of 100, placing it in the top 20 for the PlayStation as a whole, and at number 3 for 1996. Because of the popularity of the series, there have been 25 games released, ranging from direct sequels to wild spin-offs, with 2 more games currently in development. In addition, a popular movie franchise as well as a series of adapted novels by author S.D. Perry have been released. Combined with its 2 re-releases, Resident Evil 1 has managed to sell over 5 million copies, and the franchise as a whole has sold nearly 70 million. I mean, seriously, look at these numbers. It crushed out legions of other games financially and critically. I personally think that a wealth of the zombification of popular media these days can be narrowly traced back to the original Resident Evil. But why? Is it the scares? The puzzles? No, I think the answer is pretty simple. Making a good video game doesn't require a massive budget or vast development team. All it really requires is a passionate group of people who want to create something that they think will be fun. Video game design is a tough nut to crack, but if you ask any developer, love and care is equally as important as gameplay or graphics. With a lot of love and care, this guy managed to create a series that is still shambling through graveyards to this day.
Resident Evil.